thank you. It's nice to be here and to see you all. I've got sort of a PowerPoint thing that's going to help me sort of, it's the peristalsis, right? It'll keep down the gullet. And so I'm going to sort of move through the talk using this as sort of a rough outline. So this is a talk which is being drawn really from two different sources. One is a talk that I gave in Helsinki at the Research Institute in Finland. I spent a month there on sabbatical last semester. And the other portions of the talk are coming from a presidential address that I gave at the 72nd annual meeting of the Southwestern Philosophical Society. And my basic goal in this talk, and I'm mostly going to read it, so we don't take too much time and we have time for questions. My basic goal in the talk is to describe for you what pragmatic objectivity is, and to show you how this idea can be found to be doing work not only in philosophy, but also in areas which are maybe a little closer to daily life, namely history and journalism. So roughly the structure I want to go through is going to be, I'm going to talk about objectivity in philosophy. I'm going to talk about objectivity in philosophy, particularly in pragmatism and neo-pragmatism. I should have got my slides out of order, so let me. Then I'm going to talk about objectivity outside of philosophy in history and journalism. And finally, we're going to sort of pull these things together into what I think is a coherent concept, that of pragmatic objectivity. So if you're like me, you're someone who cares both about your fellow human beings and the truth. And these cares may even be related. If you're like me, you found it exquisitely painful and depressing to follow political events of the past few years. Mendacity is rampant, historical memory grows shorter by the minute, and logic was thrown overboard by some dude in a tri-cornered hat at the Tea Party. And so what's more, and I'm on a roll here, the highly educated professionals in our society who are charged with providing us with historical context, statistical perspective, or just straightforward fact-checking are really missing in action or blithely making things worse. Did you know there was a Miss Shock and Awe? There was. So I think what's needed, and what's clearly needed, is more objectivity in our discussions about the things that matter. We need more responsible accounts of reality. We need more earnest and magnanimous efforts to find the truth. Now, as you're all aware, objectivity can indicate at least a couple of different things. On the one hand, to pursue objectivity means something epistemic. It's the pursuit of knowledge or statements and propositions which have truth. On the other hand, the pursuit of objectivity may indicate that what one is after is actually metaphysical, not epistemic. It's the pursuit of some realm or state of affairs which we can call reality. Now, as you know, there have been innumerable attempts in philosophy not only to define the true and the real, but to explain how they might be the same, or different, or related somehow. Right? We hear that reality is the parent of truth. We hear that truth is the parent of reality. We hear that they're joined inseparably. We hear that they're bitterly divorced, and so on. And there have been any number of attempts as well to downgrade or dismiss terms like truth and reality and objectivity. And pragmatism itself is divided on this issue. So what I want to turn to now is a little bit of a discussion and contrast between the division within pragmatism about words like true and real and good. Now, if we listen to a figure like Richard Rorty, like neo-pragmatist Richard Rorty, we can hear him saying that words like true and good and real and rational, these are all just normative notions, right? The word true, he says, is a normative notion. It's a compliment that we pay to sentences that seem to be, right, paying their way, and that they fit in with other sentences which are doing so. So for Rorty, true is just a compliment we pay to sentences. Now, Rorty argues that we have a right and even a duty to dismiss grand notions like true and real and good, because our many centuries' quest to define them have been based on the mistaken supposition that we could somehow stand outside of our concepts and our words and compare them to the world. And Rorty says that's the attempt to really have a God's eye view, and there's just no God's eye view. It's not possible. It's not possible to stand outside our language or our concepts and so forth. This standpoint is impossible, Rorty says, and if philosophers could muster the courage, right, to recognize this, they'd see that there's actually no way to warrant our judgments beyond our appeals to social and linguistic convention. What our cultural failures to achieve objectivity, Rorty says, and if we just listen, is that we've been desiring the wrong ideal all along. We should be striving for a more constructive, healthier, and more creative way of interacting with other people, rather than striving to define and capture or just appeal to such impossible transcendental quarry like truth, or human nature, or justice with a capital J, or God's will, or experience, or any other of these sort of words which sort of appeal beyond experience. So what Rorty says is what we ought to do is we ought to appeal to solidarity. We ought to talk about solidarity and not talk about objectivity. If we talk about solidarity, we'll come to understand that really talk is all we have. And Rorty says pragmatists would like to replace the desire for objectivity, the desire to be in touch with a reality which is more than some community with which we identify ourselves, with the desire for solidarity with that community. Now, John Dewey was also skeptical about the possibility and even the practicality of chasing objectivity in any grand and absolute sense. Like Rorty, Dewey disavowed the Cartesian ideal of the lone inquirer trying to bridge the gap between mind and world, or appearance and reality. And so they're both Peirceans in this regard. They see inquiry as a living struggle from a perspective that's based in our social and communal life. So whether we're talking about common sense or philosophical concerns, what's called a problem can never really in any ultimate sense be isolated from the larger and more complex problematic situations in which we find ourselves as inquirers. We start in the middle of things. We start perspectively. We're already engaged, patient agents. Now, given this starting point, Dewey in Pragmatism no more accepts the isolated existence of objectivity per se than the isolated existence of problems per se. You know, philosophy is about solving the great problems of. There are no problems isolated from living existence. Pure neutrality, pure objectivity, Dewey says, is unachievable. We always see things from some standpoint. Now, because we see things from some standpoint doesn't trap us in a relativism, because Dewey says not all standpoints are equal. One can only see, Dewey says, right, from a certain standpoint. But this fact does not make all standpoints of equal value. A standpoint which is nowhere in particular, and from which things are not seen at a special angle, is an absurdity. So, that's a very important point, I think, that you can disavow that we can ever see anything from a God's eye perspective without saying that, well, therefore, all standpoints are equal. So here a difference really crops up between Dewey and Rorty. Rorty saw objectivity in only one way, as capital O objectivity. It's unattainable, and it's pernicious, and it deserves rebuttal, and it deserves replacement by solidarity. Right? There's only one kind of objectivity in Rorty's view, and it is a big O objectivity, and we need to get rid of it. Dewey's idea about a small O objectivity would have really puzzled Rorty, and I'm sure it must strike many here today as counterintuitive, because many believe there really can just be two perspectives on this question. Right? There's either the universal and objective way things are, right, all capitals, way things are. Right? And then on the other hand, there's this very subjective relativistic view of narrow, self-interested individuals, right? The Ayn Rand cadre. Now, for some, this construal of Dewey's objective, is going to be a disappointment, because Dewey thinks that there's really a false dichotomy at play. Dewey argues that, look, we can admit that we approach situations and people with certain interests of ours predominating. But this doesn't prevent us from striving to avoid prejudice, right? From striving to be as impartial as we can, from being as cautious as possible about the evidence before us, right? So objectivity, if you see objectivity not as sort of some ultimate metaphysical standard, but as a way inquiry can function, just think about how cautious you are when you grade students' papers, or how cautious you are when you fill out your taxes, or how cautious, right, a judge is supposed to be with the case before them. They don't have access to some pure objectivity, and they all have particular interests that predominate who they are. They are individuals. But that doesn't mean that they cannot strive to be objective with a small o. So Dewey is not suggesting that once we reject objectivity with a capital O, all standpoints are now equal. It's possible to argue that some standpoints are superior than others, and we can argue this on normative grounds. Some standpoints empower us to achieve purposes that we want, right? And purposes we can argue for. So Dewey says, look, to be objective in thinking is to have a certain sort of selective interest operative. One may have affection for a standpoint which gives a rich and ordered landscape rather than one from which things are seen confusedly and meagerly. Right? And I think, right, this is, so there's my conservatism about gardens. But, I mean, you can have standpoints which you prefer, not just because they're your personal preference the way chocolate ice cream is, but because they empower you to see things in an ordered way, or in a way that gives you sort of practical power. So the worry that acceptance of the genuine nature of standpoints opens us up to a dangerous relativism is, Dewey thought, it betrays a sort of facile ignorance about the world. Right? It's a world, this is a world where we have real problems before us. Problems that cross cultures, problems that cross perspectives. The intellectual worries about relativism don't really worry us very much when we think about the kinds of problems that we share across national and international boundaries. Dewey says, in response to this worry about relativism, even among the most disparate groups, the same predicaments of life recur, right? Problems cross perspectives. I don't know what country this is from, but I think that more than one country could probably relate. This is a great image. I'm going to put this in every possible slideshow. So the challenge then really is to try to hold these two thoughts in our mind at the same time. I know that's very hard, but we're at a university, so let's try to hold two thoughts in our head at the same time. And the two thoughts are basically this. On the one hand, there's no objective and neutral starting point. And on the other hand, we always start with certain selective interests in mind. We don't need to believe that 1 and 2 together must produce relativism, which is what almost every intro philosophy class will try to pull this on you. What about perspectives? Is everything equal? No. They can also produce a form of objectivity, which I'm calling pragmatic objectivity, that produces not transcendent truth, but rather useful inquiry. So today what I want to proceed to do is sketch pragmatic objectivity in a rather empirical way. This is not going to be sort of your head-banging Kant talk. But what I want to do is I want to survey 2 areas outside of philosophy for which this idea of pragmatic objectivity is really very similar to Dewey's, is really playing a role and functioning into how those disciplines are rethinking their own theoretical foundations. And those disciplines, as I mentioned before, are history and journalism. So let's go outside and survey a little bit. I want to move now to beyond these two competing pragmatist views. And the reason I want to move beyond them is because even if Rorty and a whole generation of postmodernists are right to claim that objectivity is just an illusory desire, we nevertheless find ourselves debating what objectivity should and shouldn't mean. I mean, this is the ironic thing, is that even if you've bought into sort of the postmodern or Rortyan dismissal of objectivity, you still hear people talking about objectivity all over the place. You find yourself using it, right? It is constantly appealed to. And that's why Thomas Haskell, who is a historian at Rice and who has a wonderful book called Objectivity is Not Neutrality, and this is why he says that, look, there's just this obstinate persistence of the appeal to objective standards. And these have to be taken with the utmost seriousness by everybody. He says, look, even if objectivity is just a masquerade of personal feeling and preference, right, we still have to ask with Alistair McIntyre, why this masquerade? Even if you want to dismiss it and say it's not serious, we don't have to worry about it, it's a masquerade which is going on, and we still have to ask, why is it going on? So as I said, I want to look outside of philosophy today, and I think it's not very hard to find appeals to objectivity in everyday speech. You can see them, and I'm going to move to history in a second, but just some slogans that we hear which appeal to this. Fact of the matter, you constantly hear people starting their sentences with this on debates and talk shows, the fact of the matter, or the way things really are, or fair and balanced, right, famous phrase, or the real story. Look, the bottom line here is, there are all these appeals to, I don't think only Stephen Colbert refers to truthiness, but someone had done a needlepoint of it, and I thought, oh, they got to see that. These appeals are all over the place, and they all imply a standard of objectivity. That's why it's really important to think it, rethink it, and argue about it. So let's talk a little bit about historians' objectivity. So I'm going to talk about historians' objectivity, I'm going to talk about journalist objectivity, I'm going to talk about critiques within history, critiques within journalism, and that will hopefully, from that will emerge just this general idea of what pragmatic objectivity is. From the late 19th century until today, consensus among historians regarding the purposes and aims of historical interpretation has shifted back and forth from approaches typically classified as objectivist or historicist to things which are sometimes referred to as postmodern or postmodernist or anti-historicist. Now, historicists view history as aspiring towards a scientific account, one giving a sort of determinate picture of past events and their causal relations. For historicists, objectivity is an ideal. Now, anti-historicists view history as aspiring towards meaningful narratives about historical events. For them, objectivity is at best, a misleading illusion or a myth. So for the profession of history, objectivity, Thomas Haskell and Peter Novick tell us, objectivity was the charter under which professional history was inaugurated. Back then, there was a cluster of ideas that comprised the concept, such as a commitment to the reality of the past, a commitment to truth as correspondence to that reality, a sharp separation between knower and known, between fact and value, and above all, between history and fiction. Historical facts should be seen, right, the historicist said, as prior to and independent of interpretation. Whatever patterns that are discovered in history are found and not made. And truth is one, not perspective. So we're trying to get to the truth about history. Now, just historically speaking, the historicist conception of history waned, it waxed, and then it waned again throughout the 20th century. There were a variety of factors at play, and I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but in a large measure, historicism suffered because the standpoint that it presumed to occupy, one which was somehow above moral and political conflict, was seen not only as impractical, but illegitimately exclusive moral concerns. So we find in the 60s and 70s historians like John Higham, who were calling for their fellow historians to reject the application of static and simplistic formulas to the study of the past. The obligation, Higham said, the obligation of the historian to become a moral critic grows out of the breakdown of ethical absolutes. If no single ethical system does justice to all situations, a complex awareness must take the place of systematic theory. And I think we have a pretty good idea of why historicism became untenable in like the 60s and 70s. You have race riots, you have women's movement, you have Vietnam protests. To think that history was getting at some, one sense of the past was untenable. So Hickham's call for a more complex awareness and a skepticism about static formulas was enacted in writing and teaching by a real pluralistic new wave of historians, women's histories, gay history, black history, and so forth. And these historians began to refashion historical theory through the expression of their interests and the expression of their perspectives. Now today, so what's the situation in history today? Well, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert, I've just read a little bit, there is no final consensus among historians about the nature of historical truth. But Haskell and others who are writing about this say that historicism is really still viewed with considerable skepticism. And Haskell tells us that the ideal of objectivity just doesn't grip us as powerfully as it did for the founding generation of historians in the 1880s. So that's history. What about journalism? Turning now to journalism, we find shifting definitions for objectivity there, too. Roughly, similar definitions. The common notion of objectivity today, Robert McChesney notes, is that journalism should be politically neutral, nonpartisan, professional, and even objective, but that these are ideas which didn't emerge in journalism until the 20th century. Right, during the early days of generations, the first two or three generations of the American Republic, such notions for the press would have been nonsensical and even unthinkable. The point of journalism early on was to persuade as well as to inform, and the press tended to be highly partisan. It was around the time that historians were adopting historicism for themselves and that version of objectivity that journalists also embraced something similar, which they called realism. As newspapers started to separate from political party affiliations, there was consolidation of newspapers got underway, and journalism faced a crisis of identity. Journalism had to ask, who were journalists, right? What was the identity of journalism, and on whose behalf did they speak? In part, one of the reactions to this, or one of the coping strategies journalists used, was to professionalize. They developed journalism schools and methods for creating professional journalists, right? So when faced with a crisis, they did what everyone does, is they professionalize. So for whom did professional journalists speak? Well, not for partisans anymore, but for the truth. As Bill Kovach summarized the term, the idea was that if reporters simply dug out the facts and ordered them together, truth would reveal itself rather naturally. This is very similar to the historical move. Now, a bit later in the 1920s, right, as consolidation keeps going, the public began to feel a little bit hinky about journalists because they saw the rise of advertising, an increase in propaganda, and just the pervasion in the culture of public relations. Public relations became an obvious fact of modern life. So to defend journalism, people like Walter Lippmann proposed that journalists embrace the idea of objectivity rather than realism. So journalists made a kind of name change. They moved from realism to objectivity in the 20s. And this could align journalism with sort of the rigor and the value-free neutrality of experimental science. Many of the legacies of the codes that journalists developed at that time are still with us today. And these codes all reinforce the naive realism which was present during journalism's first turn away from partisanship. As Stephen Ward, who's a director of a Center on Journalistic Ethics at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, puts it, proponents of objectivity, right, in journalism, proponents of objectivity drew a hard and clear line between news and opinion in the newspaper. For objectivists, news didn't differ from opinion by having less interpretation or comment. News had no interpretation or comment, okay? No opinion, only statements of facts. Interpretations contained value judgments, one person's subjective opinion. Now, today, the situation in journalism is largely, for professional journalism, is largely unchanged. Unlike historians who have been debating this and whose internal debates over the legitimacy of their historical interpretations have really led many of them to become very uneasy or skeptical about the idea of pure or neutral objectivity, journalism still officially maintains it. As Richard Salant, the president of CBS News, said, our reporters do not cover stories from their point of view, they are preventing them from nobody's point of view. What could be better? I mean, who wants to know what nobody thinks? Everybody. So while in 1996 the term objectivity was actually officially dropped from the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, did you know they had that? They had a code of ethics, right? They dropped that in favor of seeking truth and providing fair and comprehensive account of events and issues. One still finds, scholars of journalism describing journalistic objectivity as a reporting norm of being neutral, being unbiased, being balanced, right? So as recently as 2006, journalism scholars are still reporting that this is what journalism is still all about. Unfortunately, for us, the actual implementation of journalism's objectivity code is really a mess. There have been no systematic or coherent attempts to make this idea of an objective method consistent. There have only been various individual attempts on the part of individual journalists and to develop informal strategies to be objective. As Bill Kovacs, and he's one of the founders of the Project for Excellence in Journalism, some of you may have heard that, puts it, there's nothing approaching standard rules of evidence. Right? There's nothing approaching standard rules of evidence, as in the law, or agreed on method of observation, as in the conduct of scientific experiments. No system. So they have this code of objectivity. Everyone's supposed to abide by it. They teach it in journalism school. But there's been no systematic or coherent attempts to actually formulate it. Right. So that really leaves journalists sort of on their own to basically make stuff up. I mean, invent what would count as objectivity. So what this leads critics like Jay Rosen to say about the state of journalism is, it's not an exaggeration to say that journalism is the last refuge of objectivity as an epistemology. Nobody else takes this notion seriously anymore. Yet in journalism, this concept remains. You can imagine how beloved he is by journalists. Right? But he's at NYU. He's got a tenured slot in the media studies department, so they can hate him all they want. Okay, so now I want to go ahead and go back to history. So sort of laid out the brief history of objectivity in history. and the brief history of objectivity in journalism. And now I want to just give you the fast critiques that are coming from within history about objectivity, and the fast critiques that are coming from within media studies about journalism. And I think by doing that, you'll see that the notion, the sort of solving notion of a pragmatic objectivity comes from both fields, and that they're significantly similar to what Dewey proposed as pragmatic objectivity. So far I've laid out a few dominant features of the history of objectivity in history and in journalism. And now I want to turn briefly to look at how critics within these two fields have attacked objectivity. And these critics' proposals can amount to what I think can be called pragmatic objectivity. In history, as I mentioned, the pendulum has swung away from the notion that history can or should provide a picture of the real past. Still, the disagreement between historicists and anti-historicists represents an ongoing and primary tension. So this is still the primary tension, even though a majority of historians are really on one side. We're still fighting about it. Can the historian strive in good faith towards pure interpretive neutrality and detachment, or is all interpretation just relativistically up for grabs? Is there any middle ground? These are the stakes. Historians like Thomas Haskell, and there are others, James Kloppenberg is another one, are arguing that there's a middle ground once we reject the alternatives. Well, how do we reject the alternatives? Well, we can reject on one hand historicism because pure neutrality is just implausible. We can understand this if we see that facts, this is Haskell, facts only take shape under the aegis of paradigms, presuppositions, theories, and the like. There's no raw encounter with facts. And there's also no such animal as the purely detached and selfless scholar who's perfectly passive and receptive mirror of external reality. Right? So if this was the model for historians, they can't do it, and they can't do it because that's not what facts are, and they can't do it because there's no way to set aside all of who they are to. How do you set yourself aside? Put it in a nutshell. And yet, Haskell says, so if this is one side of the dilemma, the other side is the postmodern solution. This is also not satisfactory to Haskell, because the problem with the postmodern or the anti-historicist side is that it removes too many checks on interpretation and meaning, right? And so what it yields, Haskell writes, is a dizzying boundlessness of interpretation that implies the absence of any but self-imposed constraints on one. Right? It's all a play of signifiers, right? It's all symbols. It's all play. And Haskell says, morally this is objectionable because, if you think about historical interpretation just being a matter of the boundlessness of interpretation or the play of signifiers, well, what do? When you read the Amnesty report, Amnesty International report, he says, do our objections to torture have no better foundation than the play of signifiers? Right? Are the torturers' practices just the product of our particular cultural and historical situation incommensurably different from our own? Come on. You can't deal with problems if you go that route. But there's another way between these two bad alternatives. And Haskell calls it a modest historicism, but I think it could just as easily be named pragmatic objectivity. The first aspect of this pragmatic objectivity is the rejection of metaphysical grounds for objectivity. And so Haskell says, look, if you look at both the historicist and the anti-historicist schemes, they're both tied to metaphysical stakes. On the one hand, you have the capital R real past. Right? On the other hand, you have the boundless play of signifiers. These grounds, historians and philosophers and others know, are notoriously hard to prove, right? And very hard to get actual guidance from. And so this in turn makes writing good history harder. And so grounds for historical practice need to make it possible for historians to keep their debates in close proximity to the concrete and specific and occasionally pressing problems that give historical debates salience to begin with. We worry about the history of Mexico because we have a border with Mexico. We don't want to forget that. So then on what should we base objectivity? Well, for Haskell, the suggestion is that there are features relevant to objectivity which we can find in everyday life. He says, the ideal of objectivity pervades the world of our everyday affairs. The ideal is tacitly invoked every time anyone opens a letter, picks up a newspaper, walks into a courtroom, or decides which of two squabbling children to believe. In a more familiar pragmatist jargon, you could say that the idea of objectivity is meaningful because it's already doing work in everyday life. And whether or not an idea can be proved with theoretical reason, we can accept our analyses as legitimate or legitimate enough on the basis of our deeply rooted epistemic and moral practices in which objectivity plays a real role. So, if you insist on asking, yeah, but what is objectivity, Haskell? You learn that you should really understand it as a kind of stance. Objectivity is, it's not a place, it's not a pure method, it's a stance, it's an attitude. It's a kind of habituated conduct that emerges when a set of sort of epistemic and characterological virtues are inculcated and integrated into everyday life. Okay? So, if you think of objectivity as a kind of stance, you understand it as sort of a way of acting in the world, right? As a way of proceeding that by some epistemic limitations, right? The limitation of, well, I'm going to try to abandon wishful thinking, I'm going to try to assimilate bad news as I get it, I'm going to discard pleasing interpretations which happen also to be illogical. It's a commitment to suspending or bracketing one's own perceptions long enough to enter sympathetically into the alien, possibly repugnant perspectives of rival thinkers. Right? I mean, it's detachment. And so what he's suggesting is that objectivity is a stance towards inquiry which requires detachment. Not the Cartesian detachment which puts everything about your personal history and emotions aside, but it's a detachment which takes a kind of, scientists or just a good judge's caution into the, the evaluation of a situation. And he calls this really an ascetic virtue, or a set of ascetic virtues. So in sum for Haskell, and I'm sort of I'm coming into the end section, so you're very patient. Objectivity for Haskell is a stance which depends on ascetic self-discipline of an especially epistemic sort. It relies on detachment not as an end in itself, but as a way of constructing the most powerful arguments, those arguments which raise and then defeat the best versions of the opponent's positions. And only after this is done can you advance your own sort of... You really have to figure out what the best argument your opponent is making if you really want to, right, defeat them. And that requires that you enter sympathetically into their standpoint. And you also have to remain open to the idea that once you enter sympathetically into their standpoint, you could change your mind, which never happens on television. Never change. No one ever says, yeah, the guy from Brookings is right. The Heritage guy never says that. The Brookings guy never says it about the Heritage. For different reasons. Now let's move quickly through some critiques of journalism. Hopefully I've brought out the pragmatic objectivity of history. Unlike historians who can sort of tolerate, at least enough to debate them professionally, a range of positions about objectivity, professional journalism has sort of hewed to neutralist objectivity. And their allegiance to neutrality has inspired voluminous and withering criticism. It's really, they really have them dead to rights. The media critics have the journalists dead to rights, but the journalists don't do anything about it. Owned by corporations. They don't have to. So I want to mention briefly just a few of the criticisms that have been launched at this journalistic pretension to neutrality. I'm going to go through them very quickly. One is the impartial voice. Have you all heard the impartial voice? It's all over the place. Jim Lehrer is, if there's ever a Mount Rushmore of the impartial voice, Jim Lehrer will be up there. He doesn't vote, so it won't influence his coverage of the news. Obviously, he has no stake in the society that he's doing a nightly broadcast for. No stake as a voter. He's proud of that, too. I like Jim. It's sort of facile. It's the embodiment of a very facile sense. I mean, he's not Walter Cronkite going to Vietnam and saying, we can't win this war. He's saying, I'm not going to vote because it might influence me. Right? What a thin reed you are. He writes a lot of fiction novels, though, so he discharges his opinions that way. So this use of the impartial voice, I'll just say a thing about it, is it's used to highlight news organizations' methods for achieving objectivity, to prove to us their objective. But it often disguises intentions. The neutral voice, Kovacs puts it, this neutral voice, without the discipline of verification, it creates a veneer covering something hollow. Journalists who select sources to express what is really their own point of view and then use the neutral voice to make it seem objective are engaged in a form of deception. They all have opinions, they all pick who's going to be on their show, and then they all assume the impartial voice. It's all deception. Right? Another thing they do is frame-free coverage. Now, frame-free coverage is a more general deception which is advanced by the impartial voice. That voice implies that there are no frames or angles being taken to stories, right? This is just the news, right? But, as Jay Rosen argues, journalists talk about politics and public life that use frames all the time, and these frames are very identifiable and very narrow. They use the strategy lens, which sees everything through the idea, through the lens of a tactician. They emphasize the winning and the losing and the game aspects of politics, right? The horse race coverage of elections. And they often disguise the economic interests. And this is a significant thing, right? Because often the frames that are present in journalistic coverage or news coverage originate in very specific economic interests. And these function by emphasizing certain stories over other stories, omitting some stories entirely. I'm sure everyone in here knows that the stock market's over 12,000, right? Okay. The amount of time spent on the stock market versus spent on labor coverage or workers' rights or things like that is enormously disproportionate given the interest that people have in those stories. Now, such frames, as Robert McChesney points out, they smuggle in values, right? They smuggle in values, these economic frames, that are conducive to the commercial aims of the owners and the advertisers, as well as the political aims of the owning class. So this is significant. Now, this use of the impartial voice and frame-free coverage have a couple of epistemic effects that are really quite significant. These tools of journalists, right, the impartial voice and falsely neutral frames, are used to enhance the impossible ideal for journalism of pure objectivity. But two very damaging effects are, first, they isolate journalists from the public. It does this because, as Jay Rosen points out, when journalists say, all we're doing is presenting the facts, the effect is both to mislead the audience while preventing any conversation about journalism and its values from the rest of political culture. After all, one of the most powerful things about journalists' declarations, I'm objective, is the hidden corollary, you're not. That's the implication. The second and perhaps more devastating byproduct of the effort, the epistemic effect of these two techniques, is the creation of balance, right? Fair and balanced. Having two sides, you've seen the debates between the climate denier and the Nobel-winning scientist, or the Holocaust denier and Holocaust survivor. Right? It's great television, right? It's in terms of its entertainment value. But what it does is it creates these balances. The journalist, in order to create these balances, sets up these extremes and then places themselves in the middle, right, as the objective middle, or the authoritative middle. They become, by the theatrics of it, the indispensable center. But then there's a nihilistic upshot of this arrangement, and that is that the journalist who occupies the middle position believes themselves to be justified in discounting all claims as biased, because after all, those are the views of the extremes. Right? So the middle has this privileged epistemic status. And so the upshot, on the one hand, is a fake debate which deludes the journalists and maybe some of the audience into believing that the journalist is a critical moderator, when in fact what the setup has actually done is it's made the journalist immune from self-correction. So the people who place themselves as the authoritative middle have actually set it up so they can never learn anything, and they can never admit to learning anything. I mean, it's quite the Orwellian situation. All right. So let's talk about the proposals and getting very close to the end here. Now, there's fairly widespread recognition among media critics, at least, that journalist objectivity is not working. Professional journalism's posture that everyone but us is highly partisan is really laughable given how deeply the press finds and frames their narrative with the help of political insiders, pollsters, strategists, and a host of media. I mean, no one believes they're neutral. Only they believe they're neutral. So what to do? So several prominent journalistic critics have called for pragmatic objectivity. Stephen Ward, who I mentioned before, the director of the Center for Journalism Ethics, actually calls his proposal pragmatic objectivity. And he says, the traditional notion of journalistic objectivity, articulated a century ago, is indefensible philosophically. It has been weakened by criticism inside and outside of journalism. In practice, fewer and fewer journalists embrace the traditional objectivity, while more and more newsrooms adopt a reporting style that includes perspective and interpretation. So, like Thomas Haskell, Ward believes that the best course is not to abandon objectivity, but to reconstruct it. Because to persist in the older pretension to objectivity is actually morally risky, right? He really thinks that, without a thoughtful reform of objectivity, we risk losing a much-needed ethical restraint on today's news media. So it's not just that it would be better if they got rid of this notion that no one can really prove or get guidance from, but that it's ethically risky for them to believe in it, because it basically unmoors them, right, from any responsibility. So, what should pragmatic objectivity in journalism include then? Like, what should it do? One idea is that it should include this sort of limited epistemic habit of detachment, which it's very similar to what Haskell mentions, what Ward proposes, right? So that it'll facilitate inquiry without asking journalists to place all their emotions, perspectives, purposes, and values on the side. Right? Another thing it does is it says, look, what journalists should do is they should say, if you want to know, well, what's going to guide the journalists if they're no longer going to be neutral? Well, what should guide them is the public. And the public, if we remember that the public is not just what the polls tell us the public is, not just a market for information, not just an audience, a television audience. If you think of the public as Dewey did, and Ward actually refers specifically to Dewey, the public is when a group of us get together in response to problems for the purpose of inquiry. So the way students on this campus get together to try to make the campus greener, or to protest raises in student fees or rises in tuition. Publics form in response to problems. And if journalists link their standards and their guidance to the publics that they're covering, they will be guided. It won't be a relativism festival for journalists. Right? So there are some calls out from Ward and from McChesney and John Nichols and others for Jay Rosen for public journalism. And so the idea is that journalists should get off their high horse, off their objectivist perch, and they should return to a much more engaged and dialogical relationship between the journalist and the public, like they had when newspapers were partisan. They were listening to partisan people, and they expressed those views and reformulated them in their newspapers, right? And so journalists that reconnect with the public dialogically can re-engage with objectivity in a more pragmatic way. And this would allow Jim Lehrer to go and vote, because the journalists would now see themselves within the political community as a responsible member with a full stake in public life. I mean, I don't know if you're like me, but you watch journalists and you think, don't these guys who set up this fake debate about climate change, don't they care if their kids are on a planet that is cooking itself to death? I mean, you listen to them ask the question, well, what about the people who say that, 90% of Nobel laureates are all wrong on this? It's like asking that question almost implies that they're not living on the same planet that's going to heat up. And so this would put them back into, it would sort of resituate them back. Okay, now I'm like a minute away. Okay. I really meant this to be a little shorter, but you've heard that before. Okay, so now near the beginning of my talk, I quoted Richard Rorty, who told us that because philosophy has been unable to achieve perfect objectivity, a God's eye view, it would be best that we resign ourselves to solidarity through conversation. But what will guide our conversation, right, we ask? More conversation is Rorty's answer, and we have to let go of the idea that we could ever get traction in anything besides conversation. I've argued elsewhere that there are other choices besides the ones that Rorty depicts. Other choices besides, on the one hand, just the conversation, and on the other hand, truth, goodness, right, objectivity with a capital O. What I hope I've shown you today is that the third option, which John Dewey provided, what I've been calling pragmatic objectivity, is also emerging from similar dilemmas in the fields of history and journalism. And the theorists in those fields are not only affirming the plausibility of pragmatic objectivity as a basic principle, but they're expanding it with their own accounts of our epistemic habits, critiques of the economic and political structures that are currently disguised by objectivity, and they're re-envisioning new ideals for how journalism, the public, and democratic life should be connected. And I would urge you to go read them, because they're a lot of fun. Thanks very much.
So,
those readings you just referred to, those are the two books.
So there's Thomas Haskell, Objectivity is Not Neutrality, and there's a book by Jay Rosen called What Journalists Do. I know there are some folks who have things to get to, so we can move down to questions. Happy to move to questions, but anyone who needs to leave, please feel free.
When you mentioned that the journalists should get back into the public, I'm not sure how to phrase this right, but should resituate themselves with the public again. It reminds me, those you mentioned the public as being select sometimes, being select public. Like the Green Movement is a green people. The Green Movement has their select individuals that pursue that sort of policy, the policies for a better environment. There's the liberals in certain areas pursuing their agenda. So doesn't that give us a sense of are they re-biasing themselves again, or being more selective in their journalism, being more selective in the sense of putting forth only that segment of that perspective in their news reporting?
I think some of the ways that so journalism often appeals to these very fragmented groups, right? And so so you're just going to have journalists for liberals and journalists for Greens, and I mean that's the danger, right? That this doesn't bring us together. And I think the suggestion is what we need is more reporting on local issues. So, for example, I don't know what the political affiliations of the people at my bus stop are, but when we talk about the school, the K through 12 budget, we're not even thinking in those categories. And so, there's been a huge decline of the number of journalists who are covering local stories. Local reporting is really at an all-time low. So what's in our water, what's our school funding, we have a lot of coverage about celebrities and crime, but those are big money savers for newspapers. And I guess the suggestion from people like McChesney and others is, if you get reporters back covering the local congressperson or the local city council or the local, right, or the Board of Regents, we have no reporter covering the Board of Regents here, right, even though it's the Board of Regents for an entire system, right? You get a reporter covering the Board of Regents, and I guarantee they will have a public that's interested, regardless of whether they're green, conservative, or liberal, because everyone's stake is so tied into that kind of
I see.
that kind of an interest.
So you mean it's like more community, it can be community oriented as opposed, and very much political, but it's influenced, everyone is influenced or everyone has a stake in that sort of,
Yeah. Yeah, if you think about the old school divisions in the newsroom, you've got your city hall reporter, you've got your education reporter, you've got, your crime reporter within a city's newspaper, and they're all reporting on things that appeal to people because their interests are at stake. So, yeah.
Yeah, sort of along those lines, and I don't want to risk oversimplification here, but it seems though a lot of times some of the more national news broadcasts are simply more entertaining than local news broadcasts. Maybe, I don't know, I was wondering when we were talking, the distinction between journalism and entertainment is becoming thinner and thinner. You have Colbert in there, and a lot of people, some people get their news from Colbert, Jon Stewart, things like that, and it's scary in one way, but in another way I'm wondering how would entertainment or journalism as entertainment play into like a pragmatic objectivity? Or would it have to be separated? Would there have to be a distinct separation between entertainment and journalism?
Well, I don't think I don't know if the question of objectivity is really raised in entertainment. So you're saying, I guess I'm missing the gist of the question, because entertainment news is sort of oxymoronic, and so the degree to which we're spending our waking hours reading about entertainment stories, or that valuable. Remember, the public airwaves are owned by the public, right? And those airwaves are used to convey the latest Lindsay Lohan misfortune, right? Those are not serving any public interest. There's no public interest at stake there. So I guess maybe the answer to your question is those stories would be. You could argue for why they don't deserve much airtime based on the idea that pragmatic objectivity derives its legitimacy from the interest of a public. Now, if the whole public is interested in Lindsay Lohan, I don't know. I guess there's an education problem here too. People need to know that you can't really get your news from Stephen Colbert. You can get you can get a couple headlines, but.
I'm just wondering if this is really fascinating, and I'm wondering if you see a gradation though in this whole idea of different publications. Like, would you say something like the New York Times or something like that approaches this a little bit more than some, I don't know, I can't even think what's the other end, or do you think that this is trouble across the board? And I wonder if these commentators say, well, if you look at the Washington Post or the LA Times, the New York Times, we're at least approaching something like this, as opposed to the TV things that are set up as entertainment. You got this guy on this side and that guy on that side, and the twain shall meet, because it's like a football game.
Right.
This guy and that guy.
Right.
So I just wondered if there was any allusion to hierarchies or gradations within journalistic presentations.
Yeah, I think that different newspapers do a better or worse job of serving the public. And I mean, there's a lot of criticism that the New York Times won't admit to. So they won't admit to, the New York Times has a tremendous range of biases, right? And you can look at the ads to know which economic interests they're biased towards, or you can look at, although they would argue that's separate, or just look at their coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian issue to ask, well, how many Muslims in the world are there? If they're the world's newspaper, are they doing a good job at representing a vast spectrum? And there are you could look at other newspapers to sort of question the degree to which the Times uses that standard of, all the news that fit the print, objectivity, to take a certain line on certain stories. But I guess the basic answer to your question is they probably do a better job, but I think we would really need to live in the New York metro region to know whether or not they were doing a good job with public journalism.
With the New York section of the paper. I just
I
wondered
think
if
so.
if the commentary on this whole subject went into this kind of a hierarchy at all. That there are some publications that approach this more than other?
Yeah, insofar as the journalistic profession, and the New York Times is one example of it, still make a claim that they are sort of above partisanship. NPR is terrible about this. I mean, they're so nonpartisan, it's almost painful to listen to them.
Yeah.
Although they do good reporting sometimes, and individual reporters will do really good journalistic reports, but the overall sheen of the organization and the way they defend themselves when they're criticized is, well, we're trying to be balanced. It's like, well, why should you be balanced in this case, right? This is not a case that deserves balance.
I think when you have a middleman, a middle journalistic reporter, or someone who's trying to get these two extremes to fight it out, or to argue their points of view, it's funny. I don't know. Is there any way we can avoid? Because usually that's how we see, that's how the political in our, I think as far as I see it sloppily, but how the political we call that the middle range politician gets through office through this avoiding the stream to the left, avoiding streams to the right, and to be able to just not answer any critical arguments or critical discussion on what really is details of the problem and try to fix it.
Right.
Just try to ease in there in his office and, well, I'm a balanced person and I can accommodate and so forth. But is there any way to solve, not just solve that, but to elucidate that problem more thoroughly and see what really is happening in terms of trying to solve what could be this trend that's happening so much in our country, this non-deliberation, non-thinking process, to assume the middle person is balanced. At least he's not extreme in either way, therefore he must be somewhat truthful, you see. Is there any way we can avoid
Well,
that?
public approval of Congress is somewhere around 19%, and of journalists it's like 21%. So, I mean, the people who are taking this, so one argument might be, look, the people who are taking this strategy have these very low approval ratings. And one explanation, Robert McChesney would argue, is that, well, the reason they persist in taking these fake balance strategies is that they're not trying to serve the public. They're trying to serve, right, corporations, economic interests, and the political class. And so that's why they're all okay, right? I mean, the politicians are okay with having a 19% approval rating if their district is safe or they have huge contributors and so forth. Now, the question of whether or not, I wasn't quite sure whether you were saying should, journalists be more like politicians or should politicians be more like journalists?
Is there a way we can actually get at solving that kind of dilemma socially or
well,
we can engage in this discourse, but
you sometimes, there are a few different ways, and if you read Deborah Tannen, who's a communication scholar at Georgetown, has a nice book called The Argument Culture, and she says not all cultures have arguments the way we do, right? Some cultures, like on Japanese political debate shows, there's always a third position on the stage, so it's not set up as one versus the other. There have been some experiments with political debates where they have a town hall meeting, right? So we've started to see some experiments, but then the politicians still retreat to these sort of, so you need in a way to set up a way of doing argument that's not like sports. It's not like a contest of zero-sum game, one against the other, only one person can survive. There's a nice phrase in the Tannen book says, I forget which culture said this, but one culture that she looked at outside of the U.S., American culture, is they say, argument is a journey we take together. So that automatically, right, de-emphasizes this sort of binary or this contest, this zero-sum contest. So I guess, one thing to do would be to start to set up political debates and discussions so that they didn't emulate the adversarial legal system or the football, right, the football clash. So you have to start in school. I mean, it really has to start in school, and then people have to sort of insist on it.
So, going back a bit to Dewey's objectivity, one thing that was said was that some standpoints are better than others, and it depends on where they get us, kind of thing. And then it's like, well, sometimes we share problems. Well, sometimes, I don't know. I'm thinking especially of like just recent Arabic culture, where there's just different Arabic prince in office are getting kicked out on a weekly basis, it seems.
Right.
But oftentimes they seem to be kicked out for the opposite of what we would want them, like, oh good, a democracy will be set up. Well, actually no, they're going to vote Hamas in, they'll be the last time anyone votes, we don't want women driving. Sometimes it seems the people have completely disparaging desires.
Right.
So, how do we look that in the face and say, well, this isn't relativism? I mean, do we say that is acceptable? Do we say that it's unacceptable? How can we say that,
Well, I mean, if you play with fire, you have to be willing to get burned, right? I mean, if you want to encourage the spread of democracy around the world, and you do it honestly, it's like encouraging free thinking in your classes. If you encourage your students to think freely, then you have to be ready when someone refutes you. You have to be able to take that. So I guess the question is, if you're going to suggest something, you have to be willing to give up the control. You're going to have to be willing to anticipate that you might lose control. But then the question, I guess, becomes, but what do you do now? Now that Hamas is in power and so forth. And Dewey's suggestion is that because the predicaments of life, move across international boundaries, this has been coming out in the Egypt, right? One of the things that has backfired with the Egypt situation is that we have supported a very repressive regime for 30 years with a lot of money. And what they're finding is that, it's this whole idea of hard power versus soft power. When you support the people and you support the people who Hamas wants to have control over with economic and social aid, what you do is you actually gain common ground to have a conversation with Hamas, or if not with Hamas, at least with someone within that population who might be able to wrest power away from Hamas. But you just have to think the long game.
I mean, but there are people in this country and there are people in other countries who don't think starving people are a problem. So like, you point out the most basic problem, like, well, we all think that starving children is a problem, Well, they might not.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can just feed the starving child at the risk of upsetting Hamas or India, or
Yeah, I mean, there really just a couple of options, right? You can either try to talk someone what do you want them to do, or you can force someone to what you want them to do. And so there are going to be people. So this suggestion of pragmatic objectivity does not provide a solution for the person who you can't convince and you don't want to force. You have to, you have to be willing to go for 80%, not 100%. And you can just keep trying. I mean,
It's
you can
experiment,
keep
right?
trying. You could just keep trying, and your goodwill can be thrown in your face only so many times, and then you just say, I'm taking my ball and going home. Yeah, I mean, there are no absolute solutions. It's just that there's a lot more common ground than people typically think. You think that, someone who's pro-life and pro-choice would have nothing that they would ever be able to agree on. How would you ever get them to resolve that question of whether the fetus is a person? Well, one thing you do is, instead of focusing on where they're absolutely A and not A opposed, you widen the conversation to talk about teenage pregnancy. Turns out neither of them want to have teenage kids with babies, right? Neither of them want teen pregnancy. Or both of them want good schools. And so what you do is you try to broaden the conversation away from the one issue that people are fighting about to a bunch of other issues where there's common ground. That doesn't resolve the logical conflict on that one issue, and it might not. But what it does is it keeps that conflict from becoming violent or becoming just destroying everything else. They can at least cooperate about going door to door to get the school budget passed, even though they totally disagree about abortion and choice. So you get other things done in the meantime. It's like when you're writing a paper, you can't figure out what to write, so you clean your bathroom. Right? You wind up with a clean bathroom. You don't solve the paper problem, but something else happens. Not the best.
So it seems like, and this is just almost for clarification for us, that it really does seem like this pragmatic objectivity is more of a process, more of a standpoint of trying to figure out how it is that we're going to get to a point that we can solve the issue, where, on face value, it doesn't seem like there's a way around it, but it's, almost that you have to resort back to a common value, and that's the process part. Is that what would you say that's correct? That's sort of the process aspect of.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it involves sort of it's sort of very Aristotelian in a way that it involves these virtues, right? So the person who doesn't care about the fact that there are children starving, they're not doing a very good job of sort of suspending their own perspective and inhabiting another perspective, and that's a key to resolving a lot of conflicts. Is just trying to see something from someone else's standpoint. Some people are too far gone to have that change in them, but kids, right? Kids are very suggestible. And they can be taught to be more tolerant and more, you can really teach tolerance, I think. And the point that's coming out of these thinkers is that teaching tolerance isn't just good morally, it's good epistemically. Because the more tolerant you are, the more imaginative you are of seeing another perspective, the better you'll be able to understand that perspective. And if you still feel like you want to defeat it, you'll be really well armed. If you want to think in terms of conflict, you really should understand, who you're arguing against. Really be able to argue their side as good as they can argue it. Because then you can really go at them if you think they have the wrong position still.
Yeah, I'm wondering if your view, this idea of pragmatic objectivity, really lacks metaphysical commitments. I know metaphysics is a dirty word among certain neo-pragmatists and certainly postmodern thinkers, some of them at least. But in order to arbitrate or adjudicate between two different perspectives, isn't it true that we have to at least be committed to the view that there is some common terrain upon which they are located, so to speak? What I'm wondering is whether or not objectivity, capital O, still functions within pragmatic objectivity, within this view, as a regulative idea, as an ideal of sorts. And of course, this isn't to suggest that we can ever have this God's eye view, this perfect knowledge of the terrain itself.
Right.
But we have to maintain that as a kind of ideal to which we should ought to live up to. So that's my theoretical question. The other question is, I'm wondering about this idea of public journalism. I'm wondering if it couldn't somehow justify what occurs because I agree with your politics, but I'm wondering if it couldn't also be used to justify what happens on Fox News, right? There is a certain public to which Fox speaks, and they speak more and more to that public, because ultimately the corporate interests are not always just political. There's an economic interest in trying to get the largest audience, right? So I'm wondering if this notion of public journalism couldn't be co-opted by by those who practice the form of journalism, which it sounds like you're trying to argue against. Another way of putting this, one of the ways that you've seemed to articulate what public journalism entails is by focusing on local issues or apolitical issues. But there are also publics out there that are very much concerned with political issues. So I'm wondering if there is such a thing as public journalism that can treat political issues and what that would look like. But I guess the first question about metaphysics.
That's a really good question. So I'll give you a quick answer to all three if I can. About whether or not there's a sort of a hidden metaphysics of a bad kind, because Dewey has a metaphysics, I don't think it's a bad kind, behind them. So, what Rorty would say, I'll give you Dewey's answer in sequence. So Rorty would say, if you think I have a metaphysics because I'm saying that we should move to solidarity and away from objectivity, I'm not. All I'm saying is I've read the history of philosophy and I've been among philosophers for years. No one has come up with it. We're banging our heads against the wall and it's not working. And I think what I see us really needing to do is to, what scientists actually do is they form groups and they get together and they do objections and replies and they disprove each other's papers and they repeat each other's experiments. They form a community. And so there's really not much more to the scientific method or objectivity than people really checking their answers with each other in dialogue. That's all objectivity comes to. He says, I don't need a metaphysics for that. I've just observed this. empirically. And Dewey would sort of give the same kind of answer. He would say, my suggestion of pragmatic objectivity comes from sort of empirical observation of how we solve problems. He says, Dewey says, my theory of inquiry, my theory of knowledge doesn't come, I didn't intuit it, it's not a coherent system, it's certainly not a correspondence with something really true. I look at how people solve problems in everyday situations. I look at how scientists solve problems, right? They observe, they theorize, they hypothesize, they test, they revise, they test again, someone else repeats the experiment. Saying the scientific method is not a theoretical thing. It is it's something which people have by hook and by, it's like a recipe. The best recipe is just trial and error, but now we've been able to formalize that trial and error and we call it the scientific method. But essentially what it is Dewey would say, is this pragmatic objectivity is just an empirical hypothesis based on empirical observation of how people solve problems. So there's really no metaphysical thing lurking there. I think we could still push more, but let's not. You can, but I'm not going to push myself more. As far as the question about public journalism goes, I think the suggestion, now I don't know this literature as well as I know the pragmatist literature, but I think that the idea is basically that we sort of have more opinion and less fact-finding all the time. But we still have a tremendous number of problems that are, local, regional, national, and international in character. And so if you put more journalists out there finding facts about those problems at those different levels, you would have just a lot more just good reporting about what's going on. So if we stipulate that Fox News is serving a public, right, the teabagger public is served by Fox News, you could say, yeah, but in a universe where there's a lot more good journalism out there, Fox News will start to look like a joke. And so it will sort of lose its power. That might be one way they go at it. The other way they might go at it is that, look, the things they say are just factually inaccurate about the causes of unemployment, and the way they actually spell out global warming on Fox News is just not, you can't argue that it's based on fact. You can't base it, they always talk about sound science. They have no idea what sound science is. Say, well, who's to say? Well, scientists. Why? Because they have a better method. They have a more successful method. So, that's the best I can do for this. Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, I'm picking up one thing's for certain is that the idea of objectivity is notoriously difficult to pin down. And I'm wondering if there's something to be said for the media, rather than us trying to push them towards objectivity, sort of sitting back and watching them. They do hold themselves to this standard, so sitting back and watching them try over and over again and then fail, or at least abuse that sort of role they have. And if we continue to let them do that, we'll get more and more data about what objectivity certainly is not. So I wonder if there's something to be said for the media continually evolving, trying to find ways to reach this objectivity or to present objectivity, and we constantly see them failing. At least we'll see an evolution of them pressing towards something that it certainly isn't. Does that make sense?
Would they evolve, in and of themselves, or?
It's just something about the continual process of them supposedly being held to a standard of objectivity and then continually trying to meet that yet failing. I'm wondering if we at least epistemically learn something about what objectivity isn't. I'm wondering if it might actually be a good thing that they aren't objective.
I don't know. Less and less people are watching television. That we know that. What are they doing instead? They're going on the internet, right? But so then the question becomes, what are the prospects for the internet remaining free and open? Well, because most people have not heard about the what is it called? The free internet, or
Net neutrality?
Yeah, net neutrality. That's right. Because most people have not heard about net neutrality, they don't understand the issue, and so the FCC has now just made, past December, has made net neutrality a lot less likely. So here's the reason that there's not a natural evolution. The objectivity which you're not seeing on the networks or on cable didn't tell you about net neutrality. So as you were shutting off cable and getting rid of your Comcast, you didn't learn about the other place that, right, corporations could dominate. So it's going to take us forever to get to, whether it's, a little conservative blog or a little liberal blog or Bill Moyers or Truth Out or whatever it is, or Greenpeace. If things keep going the way they're going, it's going to take us forever for that page to load. But if you want to go to Disney, man, that page is, because they're going to choke the bandwidth for the little sites. And they're going so I guess this is a long way of answering your question, but basically, the objectivity is not evolving, and it's actually making objectivity less possible in the places where people are turning to, like the internet. So then when the internet gets choked off, what's going to happen? Are we going to go back into talking to each other face to face? I can't bear the thought. We could take maybe, does anyone have a 5 o'clock class today? Okay, a few do. Why don't we call it a day here? The moderator's gone, so I get to decide. But thank you all for coming. There's food outside, and we can talk some more.
Kate is in the library.
Thank you.
I mentioned more facts. There's more opinions than there are facts floating around. Something like that.
Yeah.
Years ago.
How long are you staying?
I'll stay how long.
Stop. It's two statements, 2 sentences, period. And I wonder,
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Yeah, that's back to off point. You like Yui, don't you?
I agree.
Yeah, that's all right. I mean,
Through the airwaves, the radio, it's just two statements.
you guys go to Kripke?
Yeah, we did.
No, I have.
I guess you were the presenter.
Embassy at Vietnamese tech like
Client call early Monday morning. And,
Right. So I wonder, in that sense,
cash.
yeah, well, so what, how did that problem happen?
No problem. We talked about.
How your class is going?
Part of the dilemma. You have small factual statements that are so much truth,
I found some cool shit though, so hopefully for you
and
time.
that's somewhat objective, and all this other stuff that complements it. So I
Right.
don't know how we can actually avoid that, because
Well, I mean, because I guess not all media has to be in that form. You can have longer form. I mean, so if I understood the gist of your question, I'm saying that there's always going to be some reporting that has to get the story out in just a few.
yeah, I just wondering what problems that are invoked by that. The real factual statement of the truth is it's only 2 sentences. The American embassy was attacked by the NBA, some date, and that's it. That's all you have.
Right. So,
The rest is a whole. Just write out some.
well, I mean, people demand elaboration, right? So, the Gulf of Tonkin was a very short statement, turned out to be the false pretext which got us into the Vietnam War. So, I mean, the more people are expecting journalism to give them context, the more they're going to that's going to catch their attention, and then they're going to say, we need more. And if the newspapers, we don't have any other journalists, they're going to say, send some over.
I would say that's yours.
Right.
What does the foreign press say? I mean, Americans don't really read much foreign press. So I guess that's the only solution to that problem is having people the expectation that they deserve more explanation than they're getting.
Right.
It's like if your doctor says,
Whatever.
yeah, I saw a lump on your back. Gotta go.
I'm
Golf
looking
game.
for him to apologize.
You
Hey,
grab him and you say, no, you
just so
can't
you know,
just
I
say
did
that
try.
one thing to me. This matters. So maybe that's.
His tests killed me.
Right. That's when we put journalists up to that standard. But you're saying the standard is kind of weak as fuck. Not the objectivity. You mentioned the objectivity standard, but the other standards in news reporting would be like, Well, fill in the blanks. What does this mean? What does it indicate? What
Right.
does this refer
What's
to?
the bigger
We've only
picture?
big picture, right?
Twice, and
Yeah,
I missed.
I mean, so to a certain degree, the entertainment question got at this nicely, which is that people's willingness to treat news as entertainment lets them feel satisfied with a 1 or 2 sentence headline.
That's cool.
But that training that's bad training.
It goes to both the historical sources, not sources, but we call it historicity, is that what you call it?
Historicity.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, you talk about the historicist point of view, and you talk about on the screen up there, what you call it, historic.
Yeah.
Anyway, it goes well with that because you try to fill in the blanks of content. You have a simple story, a simple narrative, Napoleonic Wars, and you fill the rest in with this someone filling the story about what really happened from their point of view, from a historian's point of view, a different historian's point of view.
Yeah,
It's the same sort of thing happening with the historicity.
yeah, I think that's right.
It's kind of weird. That's right.
Yeah.
Unfortunate, but
Oh, well, thanks for your question.
thank you.
Hey, good to see you. How are you doing?
Excellent. Really good, actually.
Yeah?
Yeah. I have this semester and one semester left.
I got a boogie.
And I'm going to try to beg you for either a Dewey class or a... I don't know, probably either Dewey or Dewey and Pragmatism.
both.
Yeah,
Us both.
Gerald and I discussed it. While we suffered logic
West
together.
class.
Oh, no, you suffered logic together?
Yeah, it
Wasn't that
was like going through the war.
Was it the latest logic?
It was.
It was last semester?
Oh, yeah. Woo. That
It
was
destroyed
hard.
me.
It's kind of long, but.
Yeah, well, I'm probably,
Or like an independent study or something, excuse me.
yeah, I'll probably do, American philosophy next semester. Are you taking it?
I took Pragmatism.
Yeah, you took pragmatism.
You're gonna start 19th century, Emerson, Thoreau, Edwards, and then move into 20th, or is it?
I haven't decided yet. I've started sometimes with Emerson and Thoreau, and sometimes it's kind of hard to connect Emerson with pragmatism. He's sort of an idealist. Yeah, so I'm not sure, but
So it's a class.
you know,
Leaning towards pragmatism.
I consider myself lobbied.
Okay.
But if I don't do something like that kind of a seminar,
Or even like just inconvenient,
um,
like convenient summertime, like it's not really about, it's just mostly about like learning about, pragmatism, stuff like that before your
Sure.
master's programs.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about doing a Rorty class, but
I really enjoyed Rorty. I read
Yeah.
all my Rorty stuff over the summer and some more.
yeah. Yeah, maybe over the summer or maybe in the fall. If I don't do that as a course, you could do an independent study
Just
on
have
Rorty.
to email you.
Sure,
Cool.
absolutely.
Sounds
yeah.
good.
Yeah, heckle me with email.
Deal, can
Yeah.
do. All right,
And
good to
we'll
say thank
we'll
you.
work on it.
In terms of your readings of historians, do they have a sense of what they take their task to be now, given that they've let go of historical objectivity?
I was joking. I'm really not sure. I mean, I've only just been reading theorists about historical theory, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether most historians really think that much about their theoretical presuppositions once they get to work on a particular historical period. You know, it's a lot of work to sort of revisit your legitimation strategy.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I don't know what exactly they do, though. That's a really good question. There's this book.
Offered something?
So there's this book. You might look at this book by Peter Novick called "That Noble Dream," and it's like a 600 and something page history of the idea of objectivity in history. And my guess is that he's got. I've just read a small portion of it, but that he will talk a lot about what different historians do in terms of that question.
Another quick aside, and I'll let you get to this gentleman. I couldn't take your philosophy of art this semester, even though I was in prior, but I obviously couldn't finish back in the day. I have lots of stuff I'd love to talk to you about. If you got any free office time, that would be convenient.
Sure. My office hours 9:45 to 10:45 on Tuesday, Thursday.
Tuesday, Thursday, that works
Yeah.
for me.
If you go to davidhildebrand.org, I have my office hours posted there. But if you need to you can also catch me after class often on a Tuesday, Thursday. So Tuesday, Thursday at 3:15, I'm often back in my office. So,
Okay.
so you know, if you're not going to come to office hours, just give me a little warning so you don't catch me bolting off to relieve the nanny. But
I'll send you an email and I'll see if
Sure.
a day works better than another, because
Yeah.
that time is always free for me.
Okay, good.
So it's good.
All right.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, good to see you.
Hey,
Hi.
David. My name's Lee Hutchins.
Hi,
I'm
Lee.
a graduate student in political science.
Oh, nice to meet you.
I'm working on my master's thesis. Lucy McCoppy is my chair of my committee, and I'm looking for other members of the committee, and she recommended that I come, well, first of all, come to this lecture and then talk to you about possibly being another member of the committee.
What's it on?
Dewey, actually.
Oh,
She's
sure.
very much interested
Happy
in
to.
Dewey's pragmatism and the notion of the public. And my general, don't have a specific proposal yet, but my general ideas are along the lines of critiquing modern liberal democracy and trying to find solutions to.
Have you read any of Robert Talisa's stuff?
Is that Tilllich?
Tallise.
Okay, that's somebody else. Okay.
He's been writing. He's really great on. He and I have a very strong differences about Dewey. He really thinks that democracy ought to be grounded in a Peircean pragmatism.
So who's Percy? I've heard the name, but I don't know.
So Charles Peirce is another sort of early American, or not early, but pragmatist era philosopher.
Okay.
Sometimes called the founder of pragmatism, and it's Peirce.
Peirce.
But Talise has a book called Pragmatist Philosophy of Democracy, and he has another one that's just prior to that called, just look for his name. We have a couple of his books in our area, but you'll like him because he's a great writer. His books are not that long, and he's really, I think he does a pretty good job of summarizing the positions, and then he takes it straight to this question of what should a liberal democracy be.
Oh, okay, cool. So he's a contemporary writer?
Yeah, he's at Vanderbilt. He's a few years younger than I am,
Okay.
but he's just a publishing machine.
Oh, really? So what was his first name?
That's Robert.
Robert. And Pierce's?
Robert Talise.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And then Pierce's first name?
It's Charles Sanders.
Okay. I'll look at that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to be on your committee.
All right. There'll be a time you just stop by and
Sure.
talk about it, get a little more direction and help, yes?
Yeah, sure.
What are your office hours?
So my office hours are Tuesday, Thursday, 9:45 to 10:45. But I'm typically around after my class, 2 o'clock class ends at 3:15. So usually like 3:15 to 4:15 or 4:30 on Tuesday and Thursday.
Okay.
I'm off and around, but like I was telling that guy, if you think you want to come by, particularly on a Thursday, let me know. So I stick around.
Make sure you're around.
Yeah, sometimes
Okay.
exigencies. Sometimes I'm on campus on Mondays and Wednesdays too, but that varies.
But Tuesdays and Thursdays is the best days to get you.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to get together on a Monday, where do you live in town?
I live in Lakewood, right near Sloan's Lake, so it's easy to get
When are you
downtown.
on campus?
Actually, the only time I'm on campus is Friday morning, 9 to 12 class.
Okay.
I'm on class at other times, or campus other times, it's not a problem.
There are other options could be that we go have lunch somewhere in town, so we don't have to park and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We could meet somewhere and have coffee or go get lunch or something like that
Oh,
too.
okay, cool.
Yeah. So.
Email. I guess I should maybe-
So my email is the best email is my Gmail account, and that's Hilde123 at
HILDE 1, 2, 3.
at gmail.com, and I have a usual UCD David.Hilde. That'll just forward to Gmail.
Yeah.
So anyway, hey Rob, have a good one.
Thanks, Dave.
Sure.
All right, well, I'll send you an email and see if we can get together.
Sure. Remind me of your name.
Lee.
Lee Hutchins. Hutchinson?
Hutchins.
Hutchins, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
All right, cool.
Yeah,
Thanks so
I
much.
like Louis. I like Lucy very much.
Yeah, she said she worked with you on the social justice minor or whatever it was.
Yeah. I see her from time to time for that. But yeah, let's get together.
All right, sounds
That'd be
good.
great.
All right,
Cool.
thanks so much.
All right.
Appreciate your time.
Good to meet you.
That was a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank
Got a
you.
lot out of it.
I appreciate
That was
that.
great, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it ran a little longer, but I I really wanted to include the journalism stuff too, because
Yeah.
it's like whenever you can make a connection between philosophy and something that's a little bit less abstract, I like to try to do
Yeah,
that.
it's kind of it was the most enticing part. So good that
Yeah.
you got it in there.
Yeah, maybe the history part is a little harder to, but they're,
part of the conversation.
what do they call journalism? It's the first draft of history, so I thought maybe the two
Yeah.
go together.
Yeah.
Can I put something away to just go?
No, I'm pretty, it's pretty simple, but thanks.
Even the last person with the bill.
Yeah, no, that's okay. If you want to break the camera
Oh,
down.
yeah. And then we
You might have
actually.
to press stop on it first.
Oh, is it still going?
No.
We were hoping to have a chance to present some cases for you for the ethics pool at some point, if we could.
When are you? What's your time horizon?
So yeah.